I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, upon another call being scheduled between Presidents Trump and Putin, we look at the latest in Kursk, where Kyiv forces hold on to a sliver of Russian territory, and consider the steps being taken by Europe, as President Macron states Russia would have no say if Western peacekeeping troops were placed on the ground in Ukraine.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 17th of March, 3 years and 22 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined in London by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, dialing in from EU headquarters, our Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes, and live from near Salisbury Plain, former tank commander and chemical weapons expert Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. But first, over to Dom for the latest on the battlefield developments.
Well, hello, Francis. Hello, everybody. Let's start in Russia. And Ukraine's position in Kursk has been much reduced over the weekend. They now hold 30 to 40 square kilometres of land to the west of Suja, right up against the international border. Now, Ukraine's General Staff yesterday confirmed their troops had withdrawn from what they described as the logistics hub of Suja. Russia claimed on Thursday, you may remember, they had taken the town. Then, somewhat confusingly, on Friday, Donald Trump seemed to buy into a Russian narrative that the remaining Ukrainian force inside Russia was surrounded, and he allegedly urged Putin to spare them. Now, we think Russian troops have pushed over the border into Ukraine a little bit further to the west, but there has been no encirclement and hence no need to appeal to Putin to spare their lives. But as we are learning, the facts are relatively easy to prove, but if the lingering truth that remains lodged in Donald Trump's mind that Putin has been the bigger guy here and spared lives and done the decent thing, then that doesn't augur well for their future or for what's going to come out of their future relationship. Anyway, what we think is happening is this. Ukrainian troops still hold some portion of the main road running from Ukraine's Sumy Oblast into the town of Suja in Russia. Now, I think hold may be a bit generous there. I think both sides are able to fire into that area and onto the road, but probably don't have troops physically located on all the ground. The land there is open and flat, so it provides good fields of observation and therefore good fields of fire as well. It seems as if Russia's operations to hit Ukrainian resupplied trucks, mainly using FPV drones, eventually made the position of Suja untenable. Too many were getting hit on that road into the town, and that forced the Ukrainians to withdraw to the west. Now, the area of Russian land still held by Ukraine to the south of that main road is a bit more woody. There's the remnants of the river Suja there and various other wet and boggy areas. So that may explain why there's still area of land held there by Ukraine. The assessment is that Russia is yet to regain that territory completely. Otherwise, no move to the front line in Ukraine over the weekend. So that's the, quote, reality of the situation on the ground, a phrase I've borrowed from US National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. He used it yesterday, speaking in the context of unspecified security guarantees Ukraine is going to receive in exchange for further unspecified territorial concessions. Now, it's not exactly clear what Mr. Waltz meant by the reality of the situation on the ground, i.e., is he referring to the current front line, which still includes, as I've just reported, Ukrainian troops holding a sliver of land in Russia, or he might not be using the term in such a literal geographic way and instead be referring to the situation where we are now in, day 5 of Vladimir Putin ignoring Trump's 30-day ceasefire proposal. You'll remember there was a big old song and dance in Saudi Arabia last Tuesday when the US and Ukraine hammered out a deal for a temporary 30-day ceasefire. Ukraine had to make concessions, but they went for it anyway. And then the US put that plan to the Russians. Then, quick as a flash, nothing happened. Putin agreed wholeheartedly with the idea of an unconditional ceasefire as long as certain Russian conditions were attached to it. Make of that what you will. Now, you would have thought that decision to essentially thumb their noses at Trump would have sent the master deal maker into a flat spin of incandescent rage, but no, silence. No more talk of doing things that would, to quote Donald Trump, be devastating for Russia, that's what he said last week, if Moscow didn't agree to the ceasefire. Anyway, on Saturday, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov spoke on the phone and discussed next steps in discussions about a peace agreement for Ukraine, so that's nice. However, the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank, they note that the readouts from that discussion between the US State Department and Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs differ significantly. They say the Russian readout of the phone call, Lavrov and Rubio, the Russian readout emphasised that they had discussed implementing, quote, mutual understandings that were reached during the February 18th bilateral meeting in Saudi Arabia. That one was held in Riyadh. Last week's was in Jeddah. Now, Russia's communique after Saturday's phone call did not mention the more recent US-Russian diplomatic engagements. In contrast, the US State Department put out a readout. The US State Department did not refer to any mutual understandings reached in Riyadh. Now, the ISW say that discrepancy in messaging shows that the Kremlin is specifically seizing on that Riyadh meeting as part of, or trying to baseline the ongoing narrative in order to portray the US and Russia as being in complete agreement about how to go forward with any peace settlement in Ukraine. So including all the stuff about no NATO membership, getting rid of Zelensky and so on. Now, all in order to draw attention away from Putin's de facto rejection of Donald Trump's ceasefire proposal. I'm sure that minor quibble will be ironed out tomorrow when Trump and Putin talk on the phone. That's been reported this morning. Speaking to reporters in the US, Donald Trump, well, rather ominously actually, said that discussions are already ongoing about, quote, dividing up certain assets. Anyway, also over the weekend, on Saturday, Britain's Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer hosted a virtual conference of 29 mainly European leaders to discuss the coalition of the willing. I say mainly European, I think Australia and Canada also attended. He said military chiefs would get together. I'm not sure if it's virtual or in person, but they'd get together on Thursday to put more flesh on the bones of any deterrent or reassurance force or whatever we're going to call it. Ahead of that, though, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and unwitting Dearnley crush Kaja Kallas will keep the diplomatic momentum going today as she chairs the EU's Foreign Affairs Council. More on that, no doubt, from Joe Barnes shortly. A couple of other quickies, Francis, if I may. Vladimir Zelensky has dismissed Lieutenant General Anatoly Baglevich, who's the Chief of the General Staff of Ukraine's Armed Forces. He's replacing with Major General Andrei Anatov. He was Deputy Chief of the General Staff. The replacement happened yesterday to increase efficiency, a statement from the government said. Now, Rustem Umerov, Ukraine's defence minister, said on a Facebook post, "We are systematically transforming the armed forces of Ukraine to enhance their combat effectiveness." He said this involves restructuring the command system and implementing clear standards. All fairly loaded terms. He thanked Lieutenant General Baglevich, who actually only took up his job last February, but thanked him for his service and stressed that he remains in the team. Yeah, two sugars, please, Mr. Baglevich. Anyway, he's been tasked with reforming the main inspectorate. I've said transformation continues. And they're just finishing off, announced earlier today, Germany, that's Ukraine's largest military donor in Europe, second only to the US in terms of defence pledges, has donated another 3 Gepard self-propelled air defence systems, complete with 10,000 rounds of ammunition, plus 24 mine-protected vehicles and a load of other defence stuff to Ukraine today. And just to finish off with, despite all the ceasefire talk, strikes continued across Ukraine over the weekend, including last night, 174 drones fired at Ukraine, 10 got through. There were, thankfully, small number of deaths and injuries across the country. But that, Francis, is us up to date for Monday.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. Let me pick up the ongoing discussion over ceasefire. Moscow has confirmed this morning that a call between Putin and Trump is being prepared for Tuesday. Our old friend, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, wouldn't be drawn on what the two presidents would discuss. But as Dom says, Trump said yesterday that land, power plants and dividing up certain assets would all be on the agenda. Indeed, this does not sound like a president ready to play hardball following the rejection of his proposal, and it is worth remembering that many speculate Moscow is unhappy with that proposal for all the reasons we discussed in detail last week, and therefore hopes to get even more concessions by arranging a direct call. So watch this space. For me, though, the most significant development of the weekend in relation to a possible pause in the fighting or a freezing of the conflict were the words of French President Emmanuel Macron, who said, and I quote, "Russia will have no say in whether foreign troops are deployed to Ukraine to ensure a future ceasefire." He went on, "If Ukraine asks Allied forces to be on its territory, it is not up to Russia to accept or not." He then confirmed that a number of European and non-European countries were interested in participating in a peace force. Now, that very much tallies with the mood music at the Paris summit Dom attended last week, but it is worth noting just how significant, if true, that shift is. Throughout the war, Western powers have been hesitant to take actions that might breach a so-called Russian red line, a pattern long-standing listeners will recognise. This caution has effectively ceded the strategic initiative to Moscow many times, rendering the West both predictable and fundamentally reactive. Now, however, we may be witnessing the first signs of a move, a Europe willing to assert its own red lines, even when they directly challenge Moscow's. If that is indeed the case, it marks a not insignificant turning point, one just worth pausing to acknowledge. Bear in mind, some would argue, and I would probably place myself in that camp, that the full-scale invasion could have been prevented if a few thousand European troops had been stationed in Kyiv at the invitation of the president. Now we are talking about the same move being made 3 years later by European powers to try and guarantee peace and security onto the continent, after the death of hundreds of thousands of people, the destruction of countless cities, the kidnapping of tens of thousands of children, the costs of billions of dollars, and the unravelling of NATO and Article 5. But while we're on the subject of red lines, the Kyiv Independent reports 4 key terms that Kyiv believes must be upheld in order for the war to end. They are: 1. No further territory ceded to Russia, including territory in the partially occupied regions of Ukraine. 2. The return of thousands of Ukrainian children illegally deported to Russia. 3. The return of thousands of civilians illegally detained by Russia. And 4. International security guarantees in the event Moscow breaks the terms of any future ceasefire. Now, Kyiv, they report, is prepared to accept a freeze along the current battle lines, but will not surrender any more territory to Russia, despite Putin's goal of fully occupying Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts. An official quoted in The Independent said as follows: "It is not reasonable to demand that, for example, Zaporizhia or Kherson be fully handed over." Then Zelensky called Ukraine not recognising any occupied territories as Russia's as the most important red line. But it would seem that it is precisely the annexation of these regions that is on the table in the talks between Moscow and Washington. It was 3 years ago on Sunday that 1,200 Ukrainians, mostly women and children, sought shelter in the Mariupol theatre, with Russian airstrikes killing 600 of them. Now, Trump is talking directly with Putin about that territory and its people, illegally attained, being traded over the heads of the Ukrainians. Not only that, but the US Justice Department has quietly informed European officials that the US is withdrawing from the multinational group created to investigate leaders responsible for the invasion of Ukraine, including Putin. According to the New York Times, a decision to withdraw from the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine, which the Biden administration launched in 2023, just underscores that move away from the US commitment to holding Putin personally accountable for crimes committed against Ukrainians. That group was created to hold the leadership of Russia, along with its allies in Belarus, North Korea and Iran, accountable for a category of crimes defined as aggression under international law and treaties that violate another country's sovereignty and is not initiated as part of self-defence. Not only that development, but we also learned over the weekend that the Wilson Centre and the Kennan Institute, two prominent foreign policy research establishments, are to be closed, as well as, perhaps most significantly and symbolically of all, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe and Voice of America, trusted sources for many hundreds of millions of people in parts of the world without access to free press. Trump signed that order to strip back the latter, accusing it of being anti-Trump and radical. A White House statement said the order would ensure taxpayers are no longer on the hook for propaganda. Now, a few months ago, we read out messages from listeners who remembered the vital role played by Radio Liberty and Voice of America during the Cold War. Many of you lived in Eastern Europe under communism and can testify to the importance they played in breaking through state censorship. Now, some argue that with the invention of the internet, the need for such services has declined. But others would argue that in an age of rampant disinformation, accurate reporting is more important than ever, even if only from the point of view of America's own interests, let alone as defender of the free world. Many of you have written in the last 48 hours distraught at the news, and in the words of the president of Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, the cancellation of Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Liberty's grant agreement would be a massive gift to America's enemies. The Iranian ayatollahs, Chinese communist leaders and autocrats in Moscow and Minsk would celebrate the demise of our organisation after 75 years. Handing our adversaries a win would make them stronger and America weaker. As Stanislav Asiev, a Ukrainian journalist and founder of the Justice Initiative Fund, writes, "I once received an electric shock during torture only for writing for Radio Liberty. I was told that it was a CIA structure and an enemy of Russia, and for that reason alone, I was already guilty. Now, the enemy of Russia is being destroyed by America itself, and my torture seems doubly in vain." Another called this intellectual and political disarmament. The Czech Republic's foreign minister has said that he hopes the EU could help keep Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty running in Prague. But as of this moment, we understand staff are being told all federal funding has gone, with freelancers being reported that there's no money left to pay them. We understand there are concerns this will impact Ukraine coverage in certain parts of the world. And just to remind listeners that this podcast also releases Ukrainian and Russian language versions of the service so that people on both sides of the battle lines and across the region, including Central Asia and the Caucasus, have access to accurate reporting. The links for those can be found in the description for this episode. It is ironic and indeed tragic that the closure was announced at the same time as hundreds of thousands of people descended on Serbia's capital over the weekend to protest against the government, with one independent monitor saying 325,000, if not more, had gathered, making it Serbia's largest protest ever. It follows protests recently seen in Romania, Moldova, Georgia and Hungary, all countries where the radio services just described provide a unique resource for reporting, as well as Belarus and Central Asia. We will be discussing those protests and their significance in more detail this week. But for now, just a note of solidarity with our journalistic colleagues who work for those organisations and have done such amazing work over the last 3 years. We're thinking of you. But let's go to Brussels now in what is, of course, a historic period. Joe Barnes, it's been quite a long time since we've had you on the podcast. Where do you want to start? I think it would be interesting, perhaps, first of all, just gauging the overall mood in Brussels. Is there a sense of urgency at the developments that we've seen in the past week or so?
Hi, Francis, and hi, folks. Yeah, good to be back. I think the last time we spoke, I was reporting from NATO a couple of hours before Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump had their phone call, which essentially kick-started all this peace talk. And that episode was essentially ripped up and forever changed history at the moment. So Brussels is a really fascinating place at the moment. You've got this almost dual track, if we're to use negotiating parlance, where you've got everyone is incredibly frustrated at America. Donald Trump, they see anger at how he's handling support for Ukraine, whether it be the cutting off of intelligence, cutting off of weapon supplies, seemingly favouring Russia in any of these negotiations that have happened so far. So that then grows into the idea that everyone is ramping up their support for Ukraine, trying to really row in behind Ukraine with whatever they can do. But then you've got this almost looking at the EU as itself, looking at Europe as itself, moving at an incredible speed. And I remember reporting during the COVID pandemic that Ursula von der Leyen had described the EU as a tanker that wasn't very nimble. But actually, the EU is now, when it comes to supporting Ukraine and boosting its own defences, is moving as quick as I've ever seen it move. You had this white paper on defence that Ursula von der Leyen has drawn up that hopefully is going to inject 800 billion euros of defence spending over the next few years. You've got a plan that I'm sure we're going to talk about in a second that Kaja Kallas, the EU's top diplomat, is discussing with foreign ministers today. And it's all just happening at breakneck speed. And I was speaking to diplomatic contacts the other day, and they were saying, look, Joe, it's never been that we've not been able to do any of this. It's just we've never had the pressure on us to do this. And I was like, what is this? And my source was arm ourselves, come up with intelligence solutions, and saying we've always over-relied on the Americans, and now the Americans can no longer be relied on. Donald Trump would like them not to be relied on, even though there are some floating around in Europe who still think the US post-Trump can be relied on. But there are many people who just think that relationship is now for the birds, and they've got to really chart their own path. And it's a path that we would all once laugh at Emmanuel Macron for when he would talk about strategic autonomy. And now that's something that everyone in Europe subscribes to, and also including the UK, who are trying to play a leading role in this despite not being in the EU.
Absolutely. Well, let's start then in terms of the Kallis ammunition plan. Some discussion about this over the weekend. I understand you've seen the document, Joe.
Yeah, so I've got a document. It was put out on, I think, Friday, which was March the 13th. I can't remember if it was that Friday. So again, dates just roll into one. And it fills a few holes from previous iterations. So first of all, it's saying participating states are encouraged to deliver military support to Ukraine in 2025 to the value of at least 20 billion euros. And I quote, and potentially reaching 40 billion euros pending Ukrainian needs, with an emphasis on the following priority categories: large caliber artillery ammunition, air defense systems, missiles, drones, fighter jets, support to the regeneration of brigades, train and equip, including non-lethal support, and member states' contributions to European security guarantees for Ukraine. There are little caveats in this that are there to see diplomatic sort of passage through the EU. It's participating states, so it's not an EU programme as such, because you think there are neutral countries like Malta, Ireland, Austria, but there are also countries like Slovakia and Hungary who won't give military support to Ukraine. There's a few other interesting points. The first step of this proposal is they want to basically bring together 5 billion of those 20 billion euros, and that is to provide Ukraine with 2 million rounds of large caliber artillery ammunition in 2025. So we're presuming that's going to be the 155 millimeter artillery. But there's also always talk of, I think it's 122, Dom will probably correct me on that, the smaller, more Soviet era caliber that Ukraine also uses en masse. That's going to be funded using gross national income as a key. There are complaints that, say, for instance, Denmark has contributed more than France, Italy and Spain in support for Ukraine. So this goes about trying to get those countries with bigger economies, so France, Spain, Italy, who have been a bit shy on support to actually put their hand in their pocket and come to terms with what they have to do in terms of putting big numbers out there, because the likes of most northern European countries, your Denmarks, your Finlands, they've been well out there in terms of pushing up their donations. And then the other thing I'd mention from this is quite interesting is, and I will quote, "The initiative is open to all EU member states and non-EU state partners of Ukraine with the agreement of participating EU member states." So you've got different separate conversations about this coalition of the willing going on, which are being led by France's Emmanuel Macron, United Kingdom's Sir Keir Starmer. This EU plan put forward by Callas is trying to fit into that planning. So I wouldn't be surprised. I put it to a number of British sources and I'm basically waiting to hear back. So hopefully I'll have a story on it later today. But there is a world where the UK will join and help fund this 20 billion euro pot, which could grow up to 40 billion euros in 2025 for Ukraine.
Interesting. And Joe, I wonder if you could just comment, because I know you've been working on this over the weekend, this coalition of the willing. Are you sensing that this is something that there is a huge appetite for? Are there any stumbling blocks that you're hearing about? I just imagine that this is very much a subject in the back corridors and bars of Brussels at the moment.
Yeah, very much so. In the piece that Nick Gutteridge, myself, and I think Ben Farr also helped contribute a bit to it, and which was on the front of the Sunday Telegraph this week, we had a little bit of a readout from some of the conversations I've been having with military chiefs who are due to gather in London this week to discuss. And essentially, they are working out, is a troop deployment, a reassurance force, whatever we want to call it, is the coalition of the willing actually going to be able to do something that is going to contribute to Ukraine positively? So I was speaking to a European military leader last week, and they said more discussions were needed over the coalition, and whether the coalition is actually able to put boots on the ground. So for a little bit of context, what the initial talks are looking at is moving training missions to Ukraine and potentially having some troops based in major cities. And we're talking about Lviv, Kyiv, Odessa, essentially to help protect those cities, protect the port maybe at Odessa, which is a key spot, but also to help improve Ukraine's military. That is ultimately, at the moment, President Zelensky once spoke about a 200,000 strong European peacekeeping force with American help. That idea is for the birds now. What Europe and this coalition of the willing is looking at is the long-term support for Ukraine, turning it into, I think Boris Johnson, first coined the phrase, a steel porcupine that is indigestible to invaders. That idea, strengthening Ukraine's military so much so as the chief deterrent, that is the key focus of this. But then you have the side mission, which could have Royal Navy ships deployed to the Black Sea. You could have European surveillance aircraft and fighter jets patrolling the Ukrainian skies to basically police them and make sure that they're free from threats and any ceasefire agreements are being. So I think Emmanuel Macron said there could be a few thousand troops, maybe from each participating nation. So we've had Western officials have previously spoken about 30,000 troops maybe, but I think that number's probably going to be a lot less. And this is what one European military leader told us. There is a prevailing understanding that once peace is achieved in Ukraine, the coalition countries must strengthen Ukrainian armed forces in order to maintain that peace. There are many ways to offer security guarantees and support. One part of the guarantees could be patrolling of Ukrainian airspace and sea by allied countries, but also the presence of units in Ukraine to conduct training and increase deterrence. And basically, what we've got so far is these military chiefs, I think their name is Chief Defence Staff, or CHODs in short for NATO parlance. They're looking at mapping the needs of Ukraine and the capabilities that are available amongst Ukraine's allies. And this is what the person said: no decision has been made yet to support Ukraine militarily as a coalition. So there's a lot of interest. It's often how many troops are going to be sent. And I think the answer is no one really knows yet, because they don't have those answers from every country. The United Kingdom has to think about, can it send troops to Ukraine, also upholding its commitments to Cyprus, to NATO, to Estonia, national defence? Can France do that, including on top of its other priorities? I think it's got a NATO battle group in Romania from memory. So those are the questions, and it's probably moving slightly slower don't envisage, but also so are the peace talks at the moment. And I'll stop there, Francis.
Hello, Joe. Dom here. Lovely to speak to you again, bearded Brussels beauty. A question, if I may, on numbers. So last week I was in Paris for the E5 meeting of defence ministers, at which we were told 15 countries were represented. That came the day after, also in Paris, the CHODs, as you say, the chief heads of defence, also met in Paris. We were told there were 34 nations represented with, I think, 37 people. Which kind of left room for NATO, EU, don't know who else there'd be. But anyway, so with 34 military chiefs on Tuesday, 15 defence ministers Wednesday. The thing that happened over the weekend here in London virtually were 29, we are told, national leaders chatting to Keir Starmer. So my question is, who's dropping out? We don't know who's who. We don't know who's stepping up. But this is the international issue at the moment. So who is too busy not to go to the E5 meeting or to Keir Starmer's national lead, dial into the video conference for national leaders? Are you detecting some nations / entities around the Brussels Bazaar are a bit cool on this whole coalition of the willing thing and are stepping back a bit, maybe a little bit of Hungary, a bit of Slovakia, but any others who are a bit really with you are going to sit this one out? I'm just confused and intrigued by the different numbers each time all these senior leaders get together.
Yeah, hi Dom, good to speak to you again. Yeah, there is a sense of, there's no Hungary, there's no Slovakia. At all of the meetings so far, you had third parties, international organisations, you've had NATO, you've had the European Council and European Commission represented. You've also had Ukraine have been at a few, but not all of them. So I think a lot of it's down to availability, because also there are countries like Italy who have gone on the record. Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, has said she would not participate in sending troops to Ukraine unless it was under a UN peacekeeping force. And I'm pretty sure most people would rule that out for obvious reasons, given that Russia is also a member of the UN. I don't think, as I said, I don't think the Ukrainians have been at all of them. You've also got countries like Poland who have attended, even though they've ruled out sending troops. So the number fluctuates between, to what I understand, is dependent on the needs and what countries can offer. So quite interestingly, some of the smaller groups have not been, you've had not all of the Scandinavian countries have gone to the meeting itself. They've been represented by Denmark. Often the Baltic countries haven't gone to the smaller meetings, despite being completely in line with the plan and wanting to be involved. They have phoned with Keir Starmer beforehand, and then they've been represented by, say, Donald Tusk from Poland. So it varies. And look, there are countries that don't want to be involved. We had quite a lot of pushback. For the blog, we did a piece from El País, the Spanish, is it periodical in Spanish newspaper, but they said that Spain could eventually send troops to Ukraine as long as it gets the right security guarantees. We then had the Spanish embassy on the phone to us denying that this reporting of ours, even though we'd impeccably sourced El País, was incorrect. See, it depends. Not everyone's on board yet. And as I say, that there's been no actual agreement to send troops or have a military presence in and around Ukraine after the war has come to a close. Because I think people are struggling to see how a force, one, is put together and constituted, and two, a lot of people are quite wary on the fact that they still haven't got American backing for this thing that has become known as the US backstop, that basically the assurance is that the United States would come to the aid of or be supportive of these forces if they're attacked while inside Ukraine. So basically all of the same problems are still out there. Can we fund it? Can we fuel it? Because we haven't got the logistical capabilities without the US. And also, can we guarantee its protection? And the US is a big part of that jigsaw, and that seems to be moving very slowly.
Well, thanks very much, Joe. This all speaks, of course, just to the divisions you were talking about there. You've got, on the one hand, Macron saying that peacekeeping troops would go in regardless of whether Putin wanted them or was willing to accept them being there or not. On the other, question marks about whether this is even being logistically conceivable in the eyes of certain countries. So thank you very much for your reflections there, Joe. I'm going to go to Hamish now, but obviously feel free to stay on the line for final thoughts. Hamish, So much of this conversation is predicated on the idea that there is actually going to be some kind of ceasefire, and then potentially European troops will move in to try and uphold the peace, or weapons would be funneled in order to build this porcupine Ukraine. But do you think that Putin is interested in peace? I know it's been a while since we've had you on, so interested in your reflections of the developments of the past week and a half.
Yeah, thanks very much, Francis. Very good to be on here. And yeah, this is exactly what I was writing about in the paper over the weekend, which actually got an awful lot of comment. What I was trying to do is to unpack what Putin is thinking and what his views are to ceasefire and peace, really looking at the aims of his special military operation and the root causes that he keeps talking about. And when you look at that, my conclusion, I'm going to my conclusion first rather than the end, is that he has virtually no interest in peace or a ceasefire at the moment. Now, when you look at his aims, it was to subjugate Ukraine completely and integrate it back into Russia and decouple the US from Europe. Now, he believes, and Western intelligence agencies probably have a similar view, that certainly his primary aim is still possible. He believes he's winning. And as you've discussed on the pod on Friday, and Dom's said today, they are making significant progress in various areas of the battlefield. So why on earth would he stop? So that is a key thing to think about there. And then when you look at what his first reaction was to the discussions in Saudi and the ceasefire, first of all, he said that NATO should retire to its 1997 borders. Now, we're talking here about the Baltic states, the Scandinavian states, and places like Romania and Bulgaria leaving NATO, which seems completely incongruous. And it slightly loses on to the root cause. So the root causes of this conflict that Putin's talking about, well, it's simply a Kremlin code for NATO expansion. And Moscow cannot accept that other countries have agencies and that NATO expansion is driven by Russia's overbearing behaviour towards its neighbours rather than NATO being intrinsically expansionist. So then you have the issue of moving forward. The second element to his criticism of the ceasefire, or what he said the ceasefire must include, is the complete reintegration of the 4 oblasts and Crimea that they have taken since 24th of February 2022 and to a degree 2014. But a lot of these oblasts are not completely controlled by Russia at the moment. So he's saying that all those Ukrainians who are in there, particularly places like Zaporizhzhia, would then have to integrate into Russia. And we hear that, I think President Trump said on Air Force One last night that he was having good chats to Putin about land and about power generation. The inference is that they're looking potentially for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, which we've discussed many times, that Russia currently controls, being integrated into Russia. I mean, this is the largest nuclear power station in Europe, and I think provided something like 10% of the power to Ukraine before the war started. So an absolutely massive piece here. To me, and I think I've said already, no NATO boots on the ground for any ceasefire. So all the planning that's been done at the moment completely blows that out of the water. And the final bit on the Russians here, we've discussed the coalition of the willing meeting over the weekend, where Prime Minister Keir Starmer said, if Putin is serious about peace, it's simple. He must stop his barbaric attacks on Ukraine and agree to a ceasefire. Well, if you take what I've written and what I've said, then you would come to the conclusion that Putin has very little interest in a ceasefire at the moment. The other element to this, before I look at America, and we've discussed it before, but I think it's absolutely crucial. Putin is in for a massive awakening with the mothers of Russia. We understand Russia is approaching 900,000 casualties, maybe 1 million casualties. That is 1 million families. And back in 1984, 17,000 dead in Afghanistan. And the mothers of Russia marched on the Kremlin, and the Kremlin was forced to withdraw from Afghanistan. I cannot believe the mothers of Russia have changed intrinsically since 1984. So that is what I'm concerned about Putin. Now we look at Trump, and of course he has been very upbeat about the possibility for peace here. But is he and his team listening and understanding what Putin is saying? I think of interest, and I'm sure you discussed it on the pod last week, the cancellation of some F-35 orders. Now, Trump is looking to make America great again and rebuild it, a lot of it, when he actually looks at Europe and sees the great increase in defence spending that's likely over the next couple of years. He's looking for American companies to get their fair dues on that to help him rebuild. But if people are going to stop buying F-35s, then that, to me, is something that will make him really sit up and listen more than other things. I think the other element of interest is the ordering of fairly extensive airstrikes on the Houthis down in the Arabian Peninsula recently shows that he is not completely averse to using US air power. And a lot of that, to me, is, again, one of the issues of ships not going the Red Sea because the Houthis are attacking them, is they've got to go round the Horn, and that's ships going east to west. That increases the costs and increases the cost to the US. So that is something that is focusing his mind. In a similar way, if the war goes on any further, it's potentially going to affect the American economy. So when I look at that all in the round, I am not confident that we are going to get a quick and early ceasefire. What Putin is saying, it's what he's been telling us for the last 5 or 10 years, had we bothered to listen. So I think we're in a challenging position. And when we come on to the ceasefire, a part that European countries are going to play, I know there's a lot of, the Prime Minister under a lot of pressure at the moment to answer those difficult questions. And if we do get that far, and we do get British and European troops on the ground, one of the key things that everybody's talking about, rules of engagement. So I don't know if you want to move on to that, Francis, or come back to me on anything I've said about my view on the Putin's appetite or not for a ceasefire. Over.
Well, thanks, Hamish. I actually wanted to ask you about a different subject, if I may, but obviously feel free to, if you've got further thoughts, express them in final thoughts, which we'll be coming to fairly shortly. But that's about the attacks in Kursk. We've, of course, been talking about the focus on Kursk for understandable reasons the past week or so. But there have been descriptions of chemical warfare taking place there in the east, in that crucial battle area. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing in looking at that.
Well, absolutely. And I think very significant. I was talking to some medics I know over the weekend who were telling me that in the Petros area that there were a large amount of chemical weapons used over the last few days, and having quite a significant effect. We've discussed before the use, and the Russians, dare I say, have been pretty smart. They're using CS gas, which a lot of people, this is right, control agents, a lot of people probably think that these aren't chemical weapons, although they're incapacitants rather than killers. But because they replicate what a chemical warfare agent would do, that's why they're illegal. And they're incredibly effective because this chloropicrin, which is the Russian CS gas, which was actually one of the first chemical weapons developed in the First World War, is being fired into trenches. And actually, it appears to be there's a new modus operandi that we've seen at the weekend where drones are firing 40 mil cartridges full of chloropicrin into trenches, so very accurate and having an impact. And the British government announced, I think over Christmas, that they are providing Ukraine forces with respirators, with gas masks, which is excellent. But obviously that will take time for them to get there. Once they have them, then this will become less of a threat. But you've got people in the front lines, in the trenches. This chloropicrin comes in from these drones, and then they have to retreat. And it's preceded and followed up with a lot of artillery and direct attacks, and it is having an impact. And one of my observations is that this doesn't appear to be news with everything else that's happening. And because, in theory, the organisation of the prohibition of chemical weapons should be in there trying to sort it out. But it's just seen as a lesser issue. But actually, it's having quite a profound impact. And if it may well be used on a wider basis. I haven't heard of it being used anywhere else than that particular area at the moment. But that is a key point of contact. And if the Russians make advances as they've regained in Kursk here and elsewhere, then then momentum can gain momentum as they did in Kursk. And I think, go back to my original point here, is why Putin has no desire to get involved in a ceasefire while he's still moving forward.
Dom, where do you want to leave our listeners?
Thanks, Francis. So I was speaking last week about how some officials have been chatting to me just in sidebars recently about nervousness might be a little bit too strong, but just I've got one eye on the number of times that discussion about nuclear weapons is doing the rounds. Now, we know Russia loves rattling the nuclear saber. They talk about it a lot, but it's not really in the Western military or political scheme of things, the context, because these weapons are absolutely horrific, and having useful ambiguity about when or where they may be used, under what circumstances, is very helpful. And the more you talk about them, the more you might get held into certain positions. So not really been part of the discourse, but is increasingly so. And is that a helpful thing? Phillips O'Brien from St Andrews University that we had on Friday, I think it was, or Thursday, he was saying actually it is very helpful because we do need to talk about these things and this idea of if there is no US nuclear umbrella anymore in NATO, what the UK and France, European nuclear powers, could do. Anyway, I would point for the leading edge of this conversation. Have a look at Chatham House on their website at the moment. I think it's free to air. They've got an article saying, titled, France should join NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements to strengthen deterrence. And they basically make the point that President Macron's recent comments about extending the French nuclear umbrella, and then he didn't cut down ideas of French jets, because the French nuclear deterrent is both air launched and submarine launched. Britain's is just submarine launched. This idea that France could station Rafale jets that could be nuclear capable in Germany to extend the umbrella. And I've made the point, well, they haven't actually declared, i.e. made available, their nuclear deterrent to NATO. So to go another step forward and make it available to this ad hoc coalition of the willing, or in certain circumstances, I just think it's unhelpful and never going to happen in the current context. Well, Chatham House makes a similar point. They say it's a distraction at best, perhaps dangerously so at worst, to talk about French nuclear jets elsewhere. We've seen how this talk has been picked up. Poland's Donald Tusk has talked about his country needing to develop their own capability. And all this, the article says, risks the nuclear non-proliferation treaty collapsing if more and more governments say, well, actually, you know what, I think we're going to try and develop our own nuclear capability. And therefore, what's the knock-on effect not only to the NPT, but to other potential red lines in terms of weapon capabilities, chemical, biological, for example. So Chatham House are making the point that actually if France wants to be really helpful, they should just join NATO's nuclear planning group, declare their weapons to NATO, and then take it from there. And other countries that want some sort of huge military umbrella should look to invest the huge capital required to develop a nuclear capability in conventional weapons. And I just wonder if by raising this issue, President Macron now needs to control the genie that he's let out of the bottle, take ownership of this issue and the intellectual thought behind it. Or it might look like, well, first of all, it might run out of control. And secondly, it might look like he was making noises just to sound relevant at the moment with this idea of the coalition of the willing, nuclear deterrence, NATO, Article 5, and so on and so forth. So yet again, I ask you, do you think it's helpful and useful that we are talking more readily about the use of nuclear weapons and nuclear capabilities, or actually does it risk allowing the intellectual capacity to run out of control, an area we know Russia will very gladly join that intellectual debate? Question for anyone listening, and do go and have a look at that Chatham House article. We'll put the links in the episode notes. Thanks, Francis.
Thanks very much, Dom. Joe Barnes, where do you want to leave our listeners?
Yeah, Kaja Kallas is giving her end of meeting press briefing as we're on air. And she, on the question of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, has said that the EU will look at replacing US funding for that after a few, including Czech foreign minister, raised it as a point of issue at the meeting today. So fingers crossed, good news there that the EU is going to look at plugging that funding gap, and hopefully they can be as rapid in that as they have been as rapid of coming up with plans for defence. But then she also goes on and was talking about how she sees Donald Trump and his peace strategy And this is, I quote from Kaja Kallas, "What we see right now is that Russia doesn't really want peace. And also the understanding around the table is that Russia can't really be trusted. So they will seize this opportunity to present all kinds of demands. And what we already see is they are presenting all kinds of demands that are their ultimate goals." So according to Kaja Kallas, when Vladimir Putin speak, probably tomorrow, as it has been claimed by both Donald Trump and the Kremlin, Putin is going to use that opportunity to just basically put out all of these demands on the table, whether it be NATO troops in Eastern Europe, whether it be recognition over Russian sovereignty over occupied territories, or whatever Putin wants. He is going to make his voice heard tomorrow. And that is making people here in Brussels quite nervous, because Donald Trump is that unpredictable beast and no one knows whether he's going to say yes, no, maybe. But yeah, we'll have to wait on. But that is one bit of analysis to leave you with from Kaja Kallas.
Well, thanks very much, Joe. Always worth listening to Kaja. Hamish, where do you want to leave everybody?
Yeah, thanks. And slightly related to Joe's last point there, and as I alluded to earlier about rules of engagement, the difficult questions, lots of questions buzzing around the Prime Minister and others, what rules of engagement any British troops would be under in a Ukraine ceasefire force. I won't go into the semantics of whether it's peace enforcement or peacekeeping. But the bottom line is, if this force is rules of engagement, does not allow it to attack Russian forces or defend themselves against Russian forces who are breaking a ceasefire, then there's absolutely no point in being there. So when it comes to these issues, if and hopefully when a peace enforcement force is put in to police a ceasefire in Ukraine, hopefully as early as possible, it needs to have the military heft, the military grunt to deter any Russian incursions and to push them back if that deterrence in the first place doesn't work. And that is just the absolute reality. Over.
Well, thank you all very much for your time today. Thank you all very much for listening wherever you're tuning in around the world. It's going to be another big week, I think, particularly with the call taking place between Trump and Putin. And so do come back to us. And we're hoping to do a bit more of a deeper dive into these protests that we're seeing in Serbia and the potential significance for that. If indeed that government were to fall, what would that mean for the calculations of the Balkans? So that will be a subject for us tomorrow. We will see you all very much then. Until then, all the very best from London, and goodbye for now. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from Ukraine, please subscribe to The Telegraph at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please follow Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist in your language. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. We're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Thank you, and best wishes from London.